Hi everyone, and welcome to Week 8, where we cover the multiple zones of genocide in the modern history of Africa. We start by highlighting the long-term effects of the African slave trade, especially in terms of political fragmentation and economic underdevelopment, before turning to the Belgian Congo and the broader context of European colonialism in Africa. Next, we consider how the representational framework of Holocaust memory has been adapted in an African context, including both the Congo Free State and the Nigerian Civil War. Then we turn to Rwanda, first by historicizing the manufacturing of Hutu-Tutsi difference, then by contextualizing the serial genocides in the African Great Lakes region since decolonization. Finally, we cover Sudan and the genocide in Darfur, considering how the Arab-centric founding narrative of the state contributed to the manufacturing of difference, as well as the national-local dynamics at work in coordinating actions between the state in Khartoum and the Janjaweed militia. To start, a point from last week concerning the plurality of geopolitical zones within a larger continental category. There is no singular zone of genocide in Africa. Rather, we have to zoom down to the regional level, such as the Great Lakes region around Rwanda, Burundi, and Eastern Congo, or Southern Africa, including Namibia and Zimbabwe, or North Africa for that matter, which just so happens to overlap with the Middle East. This latter example of the Middle East and North Africa reminds us to not take these continental categories for granted. They're just constructs. Indeed, there are other ways to construe our geographical imaginations. For artists who imagine what Africa could have looked like if it had never been colonized. This is really just a cool map that I wanted to share. But with that said, let's dive into the history. The modern history of genocide in Africa originates in the slave trade, which had existed as a feature of society in many parts of pre-colonial Africa as part of a tributary mode of production, but which was fundamentally transformed as a result of integration into the capitalist global economy in the early modern era. Like we saw with the multi-causal shatter zone effect in early modern North America, which I briefly mentioned in my Week 1 video lecture course on Native American genocides, the introduction of new commercial incentives and military technologies were profoundly disruptive. As slave exports grew in volume, so too did the scope of slave raiding extend further and further into the interior of the continent. This was often supplied on large scale by centralized stripping surrounding areas of their population, or as a result of warfare between neighboring states. But this also involved the spread of lawlessness, as demonstrated in kidnapping or small-scale raiding. Either way, warfare was by far the most important source of slaves. These disruptive factors led to the breakdown of politics and the rise of what can best be described as warlordism, or the formation of militaristic slaving societies that fundamentally destabilized multiple regions. This led to political fragmentation and the economic underdevelopment of Africa. It is important to understand, however, that the African slave trade was not a case of quote-unquote Africans enslaving Africans, as there was not yet any pan-ethnic concept of being African per se, which was, ironically, an unintended consequence of European colonialism, as well as an important factor in decolonization. Additionally, and more importantly, there is strong evidence that the slave trades had an adverse effect on economic development. As I pointed out last week, economic underdevelopment is an important risk factor for genocide. So if for no other reason, this is why the history of the African slave trade is still important today. Ironically, the European scramble for Africa in the 19th century was driven, or at least ideologically justified, by the cause of abolitionism. The rise of humanitarianism and imperialism was not just a coincidence, nor was it the case that the spread of humanitarian sentiments was mutually exclusive with the growth of scientific racism. These discourses and practices came together by the end of the 19th century, when the African continent was almost entirely carved up by European imperial powers. A capstone of this era was the Berlin Conference, which was essentially convened in order to resolve intense competition among European states for colonies. It was realpolitarian pretense of the civilizing mission. It was in this context that King Leopold II of Belgium established the Congo Free State as his own private interest during a lucrative rubber boom. Reading 6 depicts the brutal but effective system of using violence and terror to maintain a system of forced labor. system of forced labor. Methods included widespread hostage-taking, flogging, amputations and other forms of corporal punishment, and massacre. Even if this doesn't perhaps meet certain definitional thresholds for genocide, it certainly pertains to the subgenocidal violence that we've been talking about all semester. Given the drastic human toll of this case, moreover, it's certainly relevant to our discussion, with an estimated 10 million deaths, nearly half the population. Outrage against atrocities in the Belgian Congo became an international protest movement during the first decade of the 20th century, as the advent of new media technologies were used to advance this humanitarian cause. Like I said last week, with regards to atrocity media, the purpose was to shock the audience, not necessarily to inform or provide context. Indeed, what's missing from these images is any sustained critique of imperialism, per se. The scandal wasn't the pretentious illusion of colonialism. On the contrary, the outrage at this time was the Belgians had betrayed the European civilizing mission. This gets to the gist of Reading 1, which critically analyzes Adam Hochschild's acclaimed nonfiction book from 1999, which did much to publicize the colonial violence of King Leopold in the Congo Free State by tapping into the representational framework of Holocaust memory to evoke a sense of outrage, while also appealing to the tradition of liberal humanitarianism that was nevertheless implicated in colonial violence in the first place. As you read this piece, think about Anaya Jahanara Kabir's article, Reading 1 from last week, concerning trauma and memory. Moreover, despite the drawback of Child's work, think as well about how Holocaust memory may provide an ethical or pedagogical platform for confronting colonial violence. Moving on, I must at least briefly touch upon the case, or perhaps in the plural form, the cases, of the Herero and Nama peoples in German Southwest Africa after 1904. In the supplementary readings folder, there are some pieces by German historian Jürgen Zimmerer that are especially interesting in drawing out the connections between this context and the rise of Nazism. For example, Hermann Göring's father was a colonial governor of German Southwest Africa a decade before the genocides of 1904. There are many other connections as well. But to keep our narrative moving forward, it's important to understand the ramifications of decolonization. Just because the European overseas empires were slowly dismantled after World War II, the effects of colonialism were nevertheless long-lasting. They still are, when you consider the fact that the colonial lines drawn on the geopolitical map of Africa were preserved in the post-colonial transformation, despite the fact that these boundaries were drawn in order to divide and rule subject populations. This was very much the case in Nigeria, which achieved independence in 1960, and 3 years later adopted a federal constitution that attempted to balance power between the animist and Christian in the West, the animist and Christian Igbos in the South, and the Muslim Hausa Fulanis in the North. Local and national elections over the following years reflected growing regional and ethnic divisions within the country, and a 1966 coup by Igbo military officers was quickly overturned by a counter-coup of Hausa military officers, leading to a 1967 announcement of Igbo secession in Biafra and the outbreak of the Nigerian Civil War. From 67 to 70, the Nigerian federal military government surrounded Biafra and cut off the region from the outside world. This military blockade led to a major famine. The conflict sparked a new generation of humanitarianism and atrocity media, as television and newspaper photos soon conveyed to the world the image of starving Biafran civilians. The authors of Reading 2 spend a lot of time analyzing the representational conflicts that ensued. On the one hand, in an attempt to elicit sympathy from world public opinion, the Biafran independence movement organized a sophisticated propaganda campaign that tapped into a long-standing iconography of humanitarianism, portraying the Nigerian federal military government as bloodthirsty savages, the Biafrans as innocent victims, as potential saviors. On the other hand, the authors point out the critical limitations of this propaganda campaign, insofar as it tended to oversimplify and depoliticize the conflict by drawing from a Holocaust dramaturgy, or a dramatic plot based on the Holocaust as a prototype. As we discuss this case, think about how such dramaturgy colored or influenced the Biafran propaganda campaign. Okay, let's turn to Rwanda, where we start by historicizing the dominant categories of identity. As with all identities, the Hutu and Tutsi are not natural categories. Like all identities, they're socially constructed, and they only became politically polarized over time. Prior to colonial rule, the terms Hutu and Tutsi did not designate distinct ethnic groups, let alone opposing racial identities. Rather, these terms represented more fluid, socio-economic categories that were closely interrelated through a common identity based on a common language. But that commonality was broken apart as a result of European colonization. This territory was occupied during World War I by Belgium, which in 1922 accepted a League of Nations mandate to take over colonial rule. The Belgians used a form of colonialism called indirect rule. This was basically a form of divide and conquer, as the Tutsi minority, which was about 14% of the population, was co-opted into helping administer colonial power over the numerically dominant Hutu majority, about 85% of the population. This political arrangement was ideologically legitimized through a highly racist myth called the Hamitic hypothesis, which said that the Tutsi descended from the children of Ham, or Noah's cursed son in the Hebrew Bible, and as such they were said to be racially superior to the Hutu, who were supposedly indigenous to this part of Africa. By 1962, when Rwanda became an independent state, these racialized categories continued to harden into polarized political identities. It's also important to put the Rwandan genocide into historical and geographical context, as this is a perfect example of a zone of genocide, the history of which goes back to the post-colonial origins of Rwanda, when the Hutu power movement led to some localized massacres and widespread expulsions of the Tutsi in Rwanda. Across the southern border of Rwanda, its sister state, Burundi, where there was a similar demographic makeup, Hutu majority, Tutsi minority. But the military in Burundi was dominated by the Tutsi, and when they took over in 1972, they committed a genocide against the Hutu. Flash forward to 1990, when the Rwandan Civil War began as the Tutsi-led Rwandan Patriotic Army invaded the country from refugee camps across the northern border with Uganda, thereby setting up a constant but low-grade threat of genocide on both sides. In 1993, there was another genocidal moment against the Hutu in Burundi, and in 1994, in the midst of the Rwandan genocide against the Tutsi, there were many revenge atrocities against Hutu civilians. In 1996, genocidal violence spilled over the western border with what was then called Zaire, but what is now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, we don't have time to elaborate these other cases, but the point is that we have to contextualize the Rwandan genocide within a geopolitical zone of genocide. As a discipline, genocide studies must break out of the confines of singularly exclusive case studies that are distinguishable on a country-by-country basis. Rather, we need a more searchingly and contextualized and regionalized understanding of the genocidal process, one that accounts for the so-called contagion or spillover effects of genocide, whereby a climate of mass violence moves across international boundaries. Finally, let's briefly turn to Sudan, where we start by tracing the political history of social fragmentation all the way back to the Islamization of the region by the 15th century, where the process of conquest and conversion involved intermarriage and cultural cross-fertilization, often looked no different than the, quote, Africans of the South. Arab in this context was as much a cultural and linguistic category as an ethnic one. Nevertheless, there was a legacy of hostility between the North and the South, as the Arabs of the North sent soldiers, slavers, and bureaucrats to oppress the peoples of the South. The Africans felt that the Arab elites in Khartoum were contemptuous toward the cultures of the South and treated them as second-class citizens. In 1956, Sudan achieved independence under northern rule, leading to the First Sudanese Civil War that was characterized by massacres and counter-massacres. And after 17 years of war, it resulted in an estimated 500,000 deaths. There was an interim peace from 72 to 83, when the rise of Islamism led to the outbreak of the Second Sudanese Civil War, which lasted until 2005 and resulted in some 2 million dead. In the midst of this, another rebellion broke out in the western region of Darfur, as non-Arab tribes organized self-defense forces to protect themselves from Arab militias. They even began attacking government military installations, leading Khartoum to outsource their retaliation by using local Arab Janjaweed militias. With this primer in hand, I want us to focus on two analytical issues. First, how has the founding narrative of Arab Islamic nationalism for setting up this legacy of social fragmentation and its implicit hierarchy between groups? Secondly, how have national, state-level actors from Khartoum interacted with local ones to form and execute genocide? If state-level actors have been necessary to coordinate, authorize, and plan, as well as to provide a level of overwhelming force, how are local actors necessary to identify and attack the targets of violence? That's all I have to say for now. As usual, we have our next steps, as well as our final assignments. Reach out to me if you have any questions. Anyways, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.